Earth's earliest oceans were not homes, they were conditions. Water covered the planet, but life had not yet learned how to live together. There were no stable relationships, no lasting hierarchies, no reliable ways to survive from one generation to the next. The sea did not reward balance, it rewarded whatever worked briefly. Creatures appeared without warning, filled entire environments, and disappeared just as easily. Success had no memory, survival left no guarantee. The ocean was not yet an ecosystem, it was a testing ground, an ocean before rules existed. The first long lasting seas were warmer and chemically unfamiliar, carrying less oxygen and fewer places to hide. Circulation patterns shifted, nutrients moved unevenly, and stability came and went, allowing complex life to appear, then vanish again and again. Bodies emerged without precedent. Some lacked symmetry, others moved in ways evolution would never repeat. Many of these designs flourished briefly, dominating their surroundings, before leaving no descendants behind. Movement changed everything. Drifting stopped being safe. Once something learned how to chase, stillness became a risk, vision followed, and with it came the need to hide, flee or strike first in an ocean that had never practiced restraint. But why did dominance mean so little in these early seas? What does it mean to rule an ecosystem that is still inventing itself? How did so many successful designs disappear without a trace? And why do modern oceans still echo the patterns formed during this forgotten age? Tonight, we follow the first experiments in animal life as the ocean learns, slowly and imperfectly, what it would allow to endure. But before we continue, if you enjoy these calm, unhurried journeys through science, I'd be grateful if you gave this video a like or considered subscribing. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. It's always comforting to see how far across the globe this peaceful exploration travels. So now take a deep breath, let your shoulders loosen, and together let us drift into the oceans where life first learned how easily it could be erased. The first stable oceans did not arrive with ceremony. They gathered slowly, settling into the planet's surface as heat escaped and the crust thickened enough to hold water in place. Rain fell for ages without pause, feeding low basins and newly formed continental shelves until liquid water stopped vanishing back into the sky. What emerged was not a single unified sea, but a patchwork of connected basins, shallow margins, and deeper hollows where water lingered long enough to shape chemistry, temperature, and movement into something repeatable. These early oceans would feel unfamiliar if seen today. They were generally warmer, sometimes by many degrees, and their chemistry reflected a planet still stabilizing itself. Dissolved iron stained the water, sulfur compounds drifted through lower layers, and oxygen remained scarce across large regions. Instead of clear boundaries between surface and depth, mixing often blurred the water column. Currents did not yet follow predictable global patterns. They shifted with tectonic changes, volcanic heat, and the slow rearrangement of continents that were themselves still forming and breaking apart. Circulation was uneven and often localized. In some places, nutrients accumulated in quiet shallows where sunlight reached the seafloor. In others, deep waters remained isolated, cold only by comparison, and chemically hostile to most emerging life. These contrasts mattered. They created zones where survival was possible for long stretches of time, allowing life to persist rather than constantly reset. Stability did not mean gentleness, but it allowed repetition, and repetition allowed adaptation. Temperature played a quiet but decisive role. Warmer waters accelerated chemical reactions inside cells, favoring faster metabolism and experimentation in form. At the same time, Heat limited how much oxygen could dissolve, forcing organisms to survive with little energy to spare. This imbalance rewarded efficiency over power. Simple structures thrived first, but the consistency of conditions allowed cooperation between cells to become more reliable than solitude. Chemistry supplied the raw materials. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and trace metals circulated through the water, sometimes unevenly, sometimes in pulses, creating temporary abundance followed by scarcity. Life learned to take advantage of these cycles. Bodies began to form not because the ocean was gentle, but because it was predictable enough to reward coordination. Cells that stayed together could divide labor, share resources, and endure fluctuations that would overwhelm isolated individuals. The ocean became the birthplace of complex life because it softened extremes without eliminating them. Water buffered temperature swings, shielded organisms from radiation, and allowed molecules to move, collide, and combine. Gravity felt lighter here, making size less costly. Nutrients flowed rather than remained fixed. Within this moving environment, structure could emerge gradually without collapsing under its own weight. These first stable oceans were not designed for life, but they permitted it. They held conditions steady, just long enough for complexity to take root, setting the stage for everything that followed, quietly turning chemistry into biology and persistence into possibility. Complexity did not arrive as a sudden leap, but as a quiet accumulation of compromises. For a long time, single cells lived by simple rules, dividing, drifting, and responding directly to their surroundings. Over countless generations, some of these cells remained close after division, not out of design, but because separation offered no advantage. Proximity allowed chemicals to pass more easily between neighbors, waste to diffuse outward, and shared rhythms to form. What began as convenience slowly hardened into dependence. As cooperation deepened, boundaries blurred. Cells began responding not only to the environment, but to each other, adjusting behavior based on internal signals rather than external change alone. This shift altered the meaning of survival. A cell that once needed only to endure now had to coordinate, to divide tasks, to accept limits placed by the group. Energy flowed inward and outward with greater intention, creating early patterns of specialization that transformed loose clusters into functioning bodies. Form followed function without foresight. Some cells took on structural roles, others focused on movement or exchange, not because these roles were planned, but because uneven conditions favored differentiation. A body offered advantages that colonies could not sustain. Movement became smoother, responses quicker, and internal environments more stable than the surrounding water. Protection increased as outer layers shielded fragile inner processes. For a time, this new arrangement allowed certain organisms to persist where solitary cells could not. The costs were immediate and unavoidable. Cooperation required communication, and communication demanded energy. Errors carried greater consequences. When a single cell failed, life continued elsewhere. When a coordinated body faltered, failure spread inward. Internal imbalance became as dangerous as external change. Mutation, once isolated, now rippled through shared systems, turning innovation into instability. Complexity also slowed response. A single cell could react instantly to chemical shifts or temperature changes. A body required coordination across tissues, delaying action and increasing vulnerability. Growth demanded resources in steady supply, making complex life more sensitive to fluctuations in chemistry and oxygen. Environments that favored bodies could also undo them, turning success into fragility without warning. As multicellular forms multiplied, so did the number of ways they could fail. Developmental errors produced shapes that could not survive beyond brief moments. Some bodies grew too large for the oxygen available. Others developed internal dependencies that collapsed under stress. Extinction became more frequent, not because life weakened, but because it dared to assemble itself in ways that tested limits not yet understood. Still, complexity persisted. The advantages of coordination, stability, and specialization outweighed the risks often enough to allow bodies to remain. Even failed designs contributed quietly, leaving chemical traces, altered niches, and selective pressures that shaped what followed. Life became complicated, not as an inevitable progression, but as a repeated experiment, one that produced more endings than continuations. This moment reshaped evolution itself. Survival shifted from endurance alone to balance, timing, and restraint. Complexity did not guarantee dominance, but it changed the scale of what life could attempt. From this point forward, existence became less certain, yet more expressive, as the ocean filled with forms assembled from cooperation, each one carrying both promise and the constant possibility of collapse. The earliest animal bodies did not follow familiar patterns. Their outlines were not built around symmetry we recognize or proportions that suggest balance or efficiency. Some spread outward in radial arrangements that blurred front and back. Others stretched long and thin, or flattened into forms that seemed to ignore gravity altogether. These bodies were not mistakes or curiosities. They were sincere attempts by life to occupy space in ways that had never been tested before. At this stage, evolution was not refining established designs. It was exploring possibility itself. Tissues folded, extended, or repeated without a clear destination, guided only by what conditions allowed in the moment. Some organisms developed multiple axes of symmetry, others almost none. Limbs were rare, but extensions appeared, used for feeding, anchoring, or sensing the surrounding water. Internal organization varied wildly, with simple cavities in some bodies and layered complexity in others, arranged in patterns that would later vanish entirely. Many of these shapes never returned because they solved problems that stopped existing. They were tuned to specific chemical balances, light levels, and ecological roles that lasted only briefly. When conditions shifted, even slightly, their designs offered no flexibility. A body that thrived in one narrow window could not adapt once circulation changed or competition increased. Unlike later animals, these forms lacked the redundancy and modularity that would allow gradual adjustment. When they failed, their entire blueprint vanished with them. Evolution at this point had no memory of success. Each generation inherited structure, but not foresight. Variation accumulated freely, constrained only by what survived long enough to reproduce. Some bodies grew elaborate without gaining advantage. Others remained simple, yet persisted longer. Shapes emerged, persisted briefly, and disappeared, leaving no descendants to carry their geometry forward. The fossil record captures these moments as isolated experiments, each one a complete solution to a problem that no longer exists. To modern eyes, these creatures feel alien because their logic does not align with what endured. We are surrounded by animals shaped by the same surviving frameworks: bilateral symmetry, centralized organs, repeated segments. Early bodies followed different rules. Their organization was unfamiliar, not because it was chaotic, but because it belonged to evolutionary paths that ended before becoming familiar. Our sense of strangeness comes from absence. We have no living reference points to soften their outlines or explain their proportions through continuity. Their bodies also lack the visual cues that signal function to us. No faces arranged for recognition, no limbs positioned for walking or grasping, no clear distinction between sensory and structural regions. Function was distributed or hidden, embedded in tissues that served multiple roles at once. Survival did not require speed or strength yet, only persistence within narrow environmental bounds. These unprecedented bodies marked a period when life was free to assemble itself without legacy. Nothing required resemblance to what would come later. In their brief dominance, they expanded the range of what a living form could be, even as most of those possibilities quietly closed behind them, leaving only stone impressions as evidence that such shapes once lived and moved in the first oceans. Before movement became intentional, most life existed at the mercy of water itself. Bodies drifted, sank, or rested, where currents carried them, feeding on whatever particles happened to pass close enough. Position mattered more than speed. Survival depended on remaining within favorable chemistry, light, and nutrient flow, rather than actively seeking anything beyond immediate reach. In these early seas, stillness was not a disadvantage, it was simply the state life inhabited. Gradually, drifting lost its safety. As bodies grew larger and more complex, remaining passive became limiting. Nutrients no longer arrived reliably, and competition thickened quiet waters. Some organisms began to shift position deliberately, not through swift motion, but by subtle contractions, rippling surfaces, or slow undulations that nudged them against the current rather than with it. These early movements were tentative and costly, requiring energy that once could be conserved. Yet they offered something new, the ability to choose proximity. Movement reshaped feeding first. Instead of waiting for food to arrive, organisms could approach it, surround it, or adjust their bodies to increase contact. This did not require speed, only control. Even slight motion allowed access to resources beyond chance. Feeding became directional, purposeful, and more efficient for those that could manage it. Over time, bodies that could reposition themselves gained advantages in crowded spaces where stillness meant scarcity. Escape followed naturally. Once some organisms moved toward food, others had to contend with being approached. Awareness spread unevenly through ecosystems. Simple motion triggered new pressures, as being noticed became a risk rather than a neutral state. Bodies adapted by flattening, burrowing, clinging, or retreating into shadowed regions of the seafloor. Movement forced life to consider distance, proximity, and reaction in ways that had not mattered before. As this shift accelerated, speed emerged as a factor, but not an equal one. Early movement was inefficient, constrained by soft tissues and primitive coordination. Acceleration came at a high energy cost, and only brief bursts were possible. Slowness did not disappear, but it became dangerous in specific contexts. A body unable to adjust position quickly enough could be overtaken, displaced, or outcompeted, even if it remained viable in isolation. The ocean changed as motion accumulated. Feeding paths crossed, habitats shifted, and once quiet zones became contested. Movement connected regions that had previously remained separate, carrying nutrients, bodies, and interactions across wider areas. With this expansion came instability. What benefited one form disrupted another. The freedom to move created new vulnerabilities, as bodies were drawn into environments they were not suited to endure. The cost of slowness was not immediate extinction, but increased exposure. A slow organism lingered longer in unfavorable conditions, remained within reach of approaching threats, and failed to capitalize on fleeting opportunities. Over generations, selection began to favor refinement, smoother contractions, coordinated tissues, and the beginnings of directional intent. Motion transformed from novelty into necessity. Once movement became embedded in survival, the ocean lost its neutrality. Water was no longer just a medium, but a space to be navigated, contested, and exploited. Life ceased to merely exist within its surroundings. It began to respond, pursue, and retreat, setting in motion an arms race built not on strength alone, but on timing, awareness, and the growing consequence of being too slow. Predation did not creep quietly into the early oceans. It appeared as a sharp shift in behavior, recorded not in drama, but in consequence. For a long time, feeding meant filtering, absorbing, or passively consuming what the water provided. Then evidence begins to change. Marks appear on fossilized surfaces, patterns of damage repeat. Bodies show signs of targeted interaction rather than random decay. Something had begun to seek other living bodies as a resource. This change rewrote survival instantly. The ocean no longer functioned as a shared medium where proximity was neutral. Bodies became opportunities, and existence gained a new risk. To be alive was now to be potentially consumed. There was no gradual adjustment period. Organisms that had evolved without pressure from pursuit suddenly faced it without preparation. Soft tissues, exposed surfaces, and slow responses shifted from being sufficient to being dangerous. Hunting did not require speed at first. Early predators relied on proximity, reach, and control rather than chase. A grasping extension, a sudden contraction, or simple enclosure was enough. These methods were efficient precisely because prey had no history of avoidance. There were no established defenses, no widespread concealment strategies, no instinct to flee. Vulnerability was common, and for a brief time, it favored those willing to exploit it. Being edible became a problem without warning. A body that had thrived in stable chemistry now carried risk simply by existing in shared space. Feeding interactions grew directional. Movement acquired intention. Contact between organisms changed meaning. What had once been incidental became decisive. Survival no longer depended only on environment, but on the actions of other life forms sharing it. The pressure this created spread rapidly. Organisms that survived encounters did so by chance, position, or minor variations that reduced contact or slowed capture. These small differences began to matter. Thickness, texture, placement within the water column, and timing of movement all influenced survival. Natural selection gained a sharper edge, not because the environment grew harsher, but because life itself introduced unpredictability. This marked the true beginning of evolutionary pressure as a constant force. Adaptation shifted from responding to chemistry and temperature to anticipating interaction. Life began shaping life. Bodies were tested not only against surroundings, but against strategies. Failure became visible through absence, and success left descendants that inherited not safety, but an arm's length of advantage. Predation also destabilized ecosystems that had only recently found consistency. Feeding removed individuals faster than reproduction could replace them in some regions, while in others, it triggered population shifts that altered nutrient flow and space usage. Dominance became temporary. A successful hunter could collapse its own resources, while prey populations thinned or reorganized. From this moment onward, the ocean could no longer be described as passive. Every body influenced the survival of others. The presence of predators forced change outward, altering shapes, behaviors, and eventually entire life histories. What began as a sudden behavioral shift became a permanent condition. Life entered a phase where survival required not just endurance, but awareness of being part of a system where living things actively shaped the fate of one another. Light had always moved through the ocean, but for a long time it went unregistered. It scattered, dimmed, and shifted with depth, touching bodies that could not yet interpret it. That began to change when simple patches of light sensitivity appeared, not as eyes in the familiar sense, but as regions of tissue that responded differently when brightness changed. These early systems did not form images, they detected contrast, shadow, and direction, enough to notice when something blocked the light or moved across it. This small change altered behavior immediately. Awareness no longer depended on contact alone. An approaching body could be detected before it touched, before it disturbed water or chemistry. Reaction gained time. Movement slowed or adjusted, feeding paths shifted, and pauses lengthened in places where light changed unpredictably. The ocean gained a new layer of information, and life began to respond to signals that existed beyond immediate physical interaction. Seeing reshaped space itself, the seafloor became a landscape of edges and gradients rather than a uniform surface. Shadows mattered. Raised structures cast darkness that lingered, and open areas exposed bodies to detection. Some organisms pressed closer to sediment or clustered near irregular features, not for shelter from currents, but to interrupt visibility. Others moved upward or outward into clearer water, where early vision worked best, trading concealment for access to suspended food and space. In open water, distance acquired meaning. A body was no longer just present or absent, but near or far, approaching or retreating. Timing shifted as responses stretched outward in space. Movement grew more cautious in bright zones and freer in dimmer layers. Vertical positioning mattered more than before, as light faded with depth and offered partial refuge. The water column began to organize itself not just by chemistry and flow, but by what could be seen within it. With awareness came concealment. Bodies that disrupted light less effectively survived longer. Transparent tissues, flattened profiles, and surfaces that scattered reflection reduced detection. Stillness became a strategy again, not because movement was rare, but because motion now carried signal. Even subtle shifts could betray position. The balance between feeding, movement, and exposure tightened, demanding restraint where once freedom had existed. Distance also introduced anticipation. An organism that could detect approach could respond before contact, altering posture or retreating into shadowed regions. This favored those that processed sensory input efficiently, even without complex nervous systems. The advantage lay not in clarity, but in speed of response. Awareness compressed reaction time without requiring elaborate structures, shaping behavior long before recognizable eyes appeared. The ocean grew quieter in some places and more active in others. Paths crossed differently. Feeding occurred in bursts rather than constant contact. Life adjusted its rhythms to cycles of light, exploiting moments when visibility dropped. The interplay between illumination and obscurity became a defining feature of survival. Once vision entered the ocean, it could not be undone. Awareness spread, reshaping interactions everywhere it reached. Bodies adjusted their positions, movements, and surfaces in response to being seen. The sea became a space where presence was no longer neutral. Light carried consequence, and from that moment on, life existed not only within its surroundings, but in relation to how clearly it could be perceived. Protection emerged quietly, without ceremony or coordination, as bodies responded to pressure that no longer passed them by. Surfaces thickened where contact was frequent, edges stiffened. Textures changed from yielding to resistant. These shifts were not defensive in intention, but they carried consequence. A body that endured an encounter without damage persisted longer, and persistence alone became a form of advantage in seas where interaction had grown costly. Early defenses were simple and uneven. Some organisms developed stiffened outer layers through mineral deposition, drawing dissolved material from the water into their tissues. Others produced spikes, ridges, or nodules that altered how force transferred on contact. These features did not stop attack so much as complicate it. A grasp slipped, a bite failed to find purchase. Time was gained, sometimes only moments, but enough to survive. Hardened surfaces reshaped encounter dynamics. A predator expended more effort for the same reward, while prey reduced the likelihood of fatal injury. This balance mattered. Energy budgets were tight, and inefficient feeding carried risk. Bodies that demanded more energy to consume were approached differently or avoided altogether. Protection influenced not only survival, but behavior across entire communities. Armor did not imply immobility, yet it carried weight. Reinforcement required material and maintenance, diverting resources away from growth, reproduction, or movement. A thicker exterior slowed response and limited flexibility. Some organisms accepted this trade, favoring durability over speed. Others remained soft, relying instead on timing or position. No single strategy dominated for long. The ocean rewarded balance rather than extremes. Spikes and plates also altered how bodies occupied space. Protrusions increased apparent size without increasing mass significantly, discouraging contact in crowded zones. Flat surfaces distributed pressure, reducing localized damage. These adaptations allowed organisms to persist in regions where encounters were frequent, even if escape remained limited. Defense expanded ecological options, opening niches that would otherwise remain lethal. The rise of protection changed the nature of competition. Predators adapted in response, refining methods rather than abandoning pursuit. Pressure spread outward through food webs as each improvement prompted adjustment elsewhere. This was not a race toward strength alone, but toward efficiency within constraint. Energy spent on armor reduced energy available for other functions, shaping life histories in subtle ways. Over time, defensive features became more specific. Some surfaces resisted compression, others resisted puncture. Layering appeared, combining firmness with resilience. These refinements reflected the kinds of forces bodies encountered most often. Protection became contextual, tuned to local interactions rather than universal threat. The ocean grew increasingly partitioned by design. The arms race began without awareness or intention. It unfolded through accumulation, each survival biasing the next generation. Protection mattered as much as speed because it allowed endurance within contact-rich environments. The cost was constant. Every hardened surface represented an investment that limited other possibilities. Life learned to navigate this balance, assembling bodies that neither fled constantly nor stood unyielding, but endured through calculated resistance, shaping the slow escalation that would define interactions for ages to come. Some of the earliest dominant animals moved with deliberate restraint. Their bodies were not shaped for bursts of speed or long pursuit, but for careful placement and control. Limbs extended slowly, capable of grasping, anchoring, or enclosing rather than propelling. Motion was precise, measured, and intentional, as if the surrounding water itself offered resistance that guided every adjustment. In these forms, success depended less on covering distance and more on managing contact. Grasping structures appeared in many variations. Some resembled flexible arms that curled inward, others formed jointed extensions that could bend and rotate within narrow limits. These limbs allowed organisms to interact closely with their surroundings, to hold prey, stabilize position, or manipulate surfaces along the seafloor. Control reduced uncertainty. A body that could secure its environment did not need to outrun it. Early rulers did not rely on chasing because speed offered limited advantage in crowded, uneven habitats. Energy was scarce, and sustained movement carried high cost. Water density resisted rapid acceleration, and soft tissues limited force. Instead, dominance favored organisms that could wait, position themselves carefully, and act decisively when opportunity passed close. Ambush and enclosure were safer than pursuit, requiring less energy and exposing fewer vulnerabilities. Precision movement allowed bodies to operate within complex spaces. Along irregular substrates, slow adjustments prevented dislodgement and reduced exposure. In dim or cluttered environments, accuracy mattered more than speed. A well-placed limb could secure food or safety without attracting attention. Control also extended to posture and orientation, allowing organisms to present armored surfaces outward while protecting softer tissues inward. This approach offered stability in a world where awareness and interaction had begun to shape survival. Control limited risk by narrowing the range of possible outcomes. However, it came with constraints. Grasping limbs required coordination and maintenance. Precision demanded time. As environments grew more dynamic and encounters less predictable, these designs struggled to adapt quickly enough. Over time, the balance shifted. More agile forms began to exploit open water and variable conditions where control offered little advantage. Speed enabled escape as well as pursuit, expanding usable space and reducing dependence on specific substrates. Bodies that could reposition rapidly avoided capture altogether rather than resisting it. Energy costs rose, but so did opportunity. Creatures built for control found themselves confined. Their success depended on environments remaining structured and encounters remaining close. As food webs expanded and movement became central to survival, these conditions narrowed. Precision could not compensate for being bypassed or avoided entirely. A grasping limb had no use if prey remained distant. Eventually, these designs lost ground not because they were flawed, but because circumstances changed. Control was powerful when interaction was inevitable. Speed gained importance when distance itself became a strategy. The ocean favored flexibility over specialization, and restraint yielded to responsiveness. Still, the legacy of these early rulers persisted quietly. They demonstrated that dominance did not require haste, only alignment between form and environment. For a time, control shaped survival more reliably than speed. Their disappearance marked not failure, but transition, as the seas continued adjusting the rules of success in ways no single design could anticipate. Size entered the early oceans gradually, almost unnoticed at first. Bodies extended farther than before, layers thickened, internal spaces widened. Growth did not announce dominance, but reflected opportunity. In regions where food accumulated and disturbance remained low, larger forms persisted simply because nothing yet constrained them. Space was available, pressure was uneven, and the cost of being large had not fully emerged. Several conditions allowed this expansion. Warmer waters supported faster metabolic processes, enabling growth without immediate collapse. Buoyancy softened the burden of mass, letting bodies expand without bearing their full weight. Predation, while present, remained inconsistent, allowing some organisms to trade agility for presence. where nutrients flowed steadily. Size became a means of storage as much as strength, buffering against periods of scarcity. Larger bodies offered advantages beyond intimidation. They reduced surface area relative to volume, slowing chemical exchange with surrounding water and stabilizing internal conditions. Size diluted damage, allowing injuries that would destroy smaller forms to remain survivable. It also extended reach, enabling feeding across wider areas without frequent repositioning. For a time, this expansion made certain organisms difficult to ignore and harder to displace. Yet, early anatomy placed firm boundaries on how far growth could go. Without rigid internal support, large bodies relied on fluid pressure, soft tissues, and external reinforcement to maintain shape. Movement became slower and less precise as mass increased. Circulation struggled to deliver resources evenly across expanding forms. Waste removal lagged. Internal coordination grew fragile, with delays between stimulus and response that widened with scale. Energy demands rose sharply. A larger body required constant intake to sustain itself, and efficiency decreased as complexity spread unevenly. Feeding strategies that worked at smaller scales faltered when stretched too far. Environments that once supported growth could no longer meet demand during fluctuations. When conditions shifted, large forms lacked flexibility, carrying too much structure to retreat or adapt quickly. Size also attracted attention. Larger organisms stood out visually and physically, becoming consistent targets rather than occasional encounters. As awareness and interaction intensified, being large increased exposure. Armor and mass could absorb damage, but repeated contact eroded advantage. Recovery slowed. Reproduction lagged behind loss. Dominance became expensive to maintain. Over time, the limits of size became clearer. Growth alone did not resolve vulnerability to changing chemistry, evolving predators, or unstable food webs. Some giants endured briefly, shaping their surroundings through sheer presence, then vanished without descendants. Others persisted longer by remaining within narrow ecological bounds that eventually closed. The first giants of the seas demonstrated what was possible when constraints loosened, but also revealed how quickly advantage could reverse. Size magnified success and failure alike. In an ocean still defining its rules, large bodies thrived only while conditions aligned precisely. When balance shifted, mass offered no refuge. Survival favored not the biggest forms, but those that balanced scale with restraint, leaving giants as transient markers of a moment when growth briefly outpaced consequence. Stability remained elusive in the early oceans, even as life diversified and interaction intensified. Food webs formed, but they rarely held their shape for long. Relationships between feeders, grazers, and hunters shifted with subtle changes in circulation, chemistry, or population size. What functioned as a reliable exchange in one interval unraveled in the next, leaving gaps where abundance had briefly existed. Dominance moved quickly through these systems. An organism could rise simply because its food source flourished nearby, or because competitors faltered elsewhere. Control of space or resources did not persist across generations. Bodies that thrived in one configuration often struggled when that configuration dissolved. The ocean rewarded presence, not permanence. Success belonged to those aligned with momentary conditions rather than enduring structures. These shifts did not require disaster. No impact or collapse was necessary. Extinction occurred quietly, driven by imbalance rather than violence. A slight reduction in available nutrients, A small increase in competition or the arrival of a more efficient feeder could render a once stable body unsustainable. Without buffers to absorb disruption, populations declined steadily until absence replaced presence. Survival became temporary not because life lacked resilience, but because environments changed faster than adaptation could keep pace. Feedback loops formed quickly. As one group expanded, it altered conditions for others, which responded in turn. Energy flowed unevenly, creating peaks that collapsed as rapidly as they rose. The ocean behaved less like a balanced system and more like a shifting mosaic of opportunity and loss. These unstable webs reshaped evolution itself. Instead of gradual refinement toward long term equilibrium, selection favored traits that allowed persistence through fluctuation. Flexibility mattered more than specialization. Bodies that could adjust feeding strategies, tolerate broader conditions, or reproduce quickly outlasted those optimized for narrow success. Yet even these advantages offered no guarantee. The absence of stability also limited memory within ecosystems. Each collapse erased pathways that might have supported continuity. New arrangements formed without reference to what had existed before. Extinction reset the field repeatedly, not as a dramatic clearing, but as a gradual thinning that opened space for new forms to appear. Innovation followed loss as a matter of course. In this setting, dominance carried little meaning beyond the present. A successful form did not shape the future so much as occupy it briefly. Control of resources did not translate into legacy. The ocean did not preserve leaders, it replaced them. Survival existed as a series of temporary alignments between body and environment. These conditions defined early marine life more than any single adaptation. The absence of stable food webs ensured that no design could settle into permanence. Life learned to persist through instability, not overcome it. The ocean remained a place where presence was provisional, shaped by constant rearrangement rather than lasting order. Within this shifting frame, extinction was not an exception. It was the natural consequence of living in a world where balance never stayed still long enough to become dependable. Much of what once lived in the first oceans passed without leaving a clear trace. Bodies formed from soft tissues, flexible surfaces, and fluid-filled interiors interacted with water in ways that favored movement and survival, not preservation. When these organisms died, they dissolved, collapsed, or were consumed, returning their material to the sea without outline or memory. The ocean absorbed them completely, and time erased the rest. Fossilization was never a guarantee. It required rare alignments of circumstance that few early animals encountered. Rapid burial was essential, sealing remains away from scavengers and oxygen before decay could erase structure. Fine sediments had to settle gently, capturing contours before collapse. Chemical conditions needed to slow decomposition, allowing minerals to replace organic matter grain by grain. Without these converging factors, even abundant life left no durable mark. In the early seas, such conditions occurred only in scattered places. Quiet basins, low oxygen zones, and sudden sediment flows occasionally created environments where soft bodies could be recorded. These moments were brief and localized. When they happened, they preserved entire communities in detail that would never again be repeated at the same scale. What survives from these windows feels disproportionate, not because life concentrated there, but because chance allowed it to be seen. Most rulers of these oceans existed outside such zones. They dominated open spaces, shifting substrates, or chemically active regions where preservation was unlikely. Their absence from the fossil record does not reflect insignificance. It reflects mobility, exposure, and the fragility of the materials that compose them. Their success worked against their memory. What remains unknowable is vast. Behaviors, colors, textures, and soft internal structures are almost entirely lost. Interactions that shaped ecosystems leave no direct evidence. Feeding strategies, movement patterns, and sensory capabilities must be inferred indirectly through scars, associations, or absence itself. The record offers fragments, not narratives. Each preserved form hints at others that moved beside it, unseen and unrecorded. This incompleteness is not a flaw of science, but a feature of deep time. The fossil record captures moments when conditions froze living systems long enough to leave outline and proportion. It misses everything else. Hard structures persist more readily, biasing survival of memory toward shells, spines, and reinforced surfaces. Soft rulers, no matter how influential, fade unless chance intervenes. As a result, history favors durability over dominance. The creatures most visible to us are not always those that shaped their world most strongly, but those whose remains endured. Our picture of early oceans is therefore a silhouette, composed of what resisted decay rather than what thrived most fully. Yet, absence carries meaning. The gaps suggest richness beyond what is shown. They remind us that life once explored forms and strategies that left no lasting imprint. The ocean held far more than stone records imply, and its earliest rulers lived, interacted, and vanished within systems that memory itself could not preserve. Oxygen did not announce its influence with visible change. It accumulated slowly, dissolved into the water in uneven patterns, rising in some layers while remaining scarce in others. This shift occurred quietly, guided by geological processes and the growing activity of life itself. Over time, what had once been a limiting trace became a shaping presence, altering the balance of the ocean without altering its surface. As oxygen availability increased, metabolism changed with it. Chemical reactions inside living bodies could proceed more efficiently, releasing greater energy from the same resources. Some organisms adjusted easily, their internal systems benefiting from improved yields. Others struggled, adapted to low oxygen conditions that now disappeared or fluctuated unpredictably. What had once been tolerable became stressful. A substance that offered opportunity to some acted as a constraint to others. This divergence reshaped survival. Bodies that could regulate oxygen intake gained stability and endurance. They supported higher activity levels, more complex tissues, and improved internal coordination. Increased energy availability allowed growth in size and function, but only within limits set by anatomy and environment. For organisms unable to manage these changes, increased oxygen disrupted chemical balances they relied upon, introducing toxicity and instability rather than benefit. Size responded unevenly. In regions where oxygen levels rose steadily, larger bodies became more feasible. Increased energy supported thicker tissues, broader surfaces, and more sustained movement. Yet oxygen distribution remained patchy. Deeper waters and isolated basins still held low concentrations, creating layered environments where size advantage reversed abruptly. A body successful near the surface might falter below, constrained by diffusion limits and circulation inefficiencies. Adaptation depended less on strength than on regulation. Organisms that evolved ways to manage internal chemistry, balancing uptake and use, persisted across shifting zones. Those locked into narrower tolerances faded as conditions drifted beyond their limits. Oxygen did not favor complexity indiscriminately. It rewarded balance between intake, demand, and waste, shaping which designs endured. Chemistry became an invisible ruler. Unlike predators or competitors, it acted everywhere at once, without intention or movement. It set ceilings and floors on what bodies could attempt. Shifts in oxygen altered how quickly cells divided, how tissues repaired, and how much energy could be stored or expended. These changes rippled through food webs, influencing interactions without direct contact. Failure during this transition often left no immediate trace. Populations thinned gradually as reproduction slowed and stress accumulated. Extinction followed not from sudden absence, but from declining compatibility between body and environment. Oxygen acted as a filter, narrowing viable forms over long spans of time. The ocean did not become uniformly rich in oxygen, and it never would. Instead, it developed gradients that defined boundaries life had to navigate. Those that adapted gained access to new possibilities. Those that could not were confined or lost. Through this process, chemistry took on a guiding role, shaping evolution through constraints rather than commands. Oxygen quietly redefined what survival required, becoming a steady force that life learned to negotiate, adapt to, and obey without ever perceiving its presence directly. Elaboration once expanded freely in the early oceans. Bodies accumulated layers, compartments, and specialized structures as long as conditions allowed them to function. For a time, complexity signaled success. It permitted refined control, expanded sensing, and coordinated movement within increasingly crowded environments. Yet, as pressures accumulated, those same elaborate designs began to strain against their own requirements. Complex structures demanded constant energy. Specialized tissues needed maintenance, coordination required signaling, and internal regulation consumed resources even at rest. When food was abundant and conditions stable, these costs remained manageable. As environments fluctuated, the margin between intake and demand narrowed. Bodies that required precise balances became vulnerable to disruption. A slight drop in nutrients or oxygen tipped systems out of alignment, turning advantage into liability. Survival benefits no longer scaled with design. Additional complexity did not always yield proportional gains. Some features improved efficiency only marginally, while increasing upkeep significantly. In a world where encounters were frequent and conditions uneven, robustness mattered more than refinement. The ability to function under a range of stresses outweighed peak performance under ideal circumstances. Simpler body plans began to persist longer. They required fewer resources, repaired themselves more easily, and tolerated wider variation in chemistry and temperature. Reduced specialization allowed functions to overlap, ensuring that failure in one region did not compromise the entire organism. Simplicity offered flexibility, not through speed or power, but through resilience. Natural selection responded to these pressures without preference or foresight. Designs that consumed more than they could reliably acquire thinned gradually. Those that balanced energy use against opportunity endured. Over time, options narrowed. Entire branches of complexity vanished, leaving no descendants to carry their architecture forward. What remained were forms that did enough, rather than everything. This narrowing did not simplify life as a whole. It filtered it. The ocean retained diversity, but within constrained boundaries shaped by energetic reality. Complexity persisted where it paid for itself, often supported by improved efficiency rather than added parts. Where cost exceeded benefit, refinement dissolved. The disappearance of elaborate designs did not mark a retreat, it marked adjustment. Life learned that endurance depended less on what could be built and more on what could be sustained. Bodies shifted toward configurations that minimized waste, streamlined interaction, and reduced dependency on narrow conditions. Each loss sharpened the definition of what worked. As these changes accumulated, evolution became less exploratory and more selective. The range of viable forms contracted, not toward perfection, but toward compatibility with long term survival. The ocean did not eliminate complexity outright, it disciplined it, retaining only what fit within energetic limits imposed by chemistry, interaction, and time. When complexity became a weakness, simplicity gained clarity. Natural selection did not erase innovation, but tempered it. The legacy of this period lies not in what disappeared, but in what endured, bodies shaped by restraint, efficiency, and the quiet understanding that survival favors balance over excess. Loss entered the ancient seas long before it carried names or boundaries. It unfolded quietly through thinning populations and vanishing shapes, leaving no single moment to mark its arrival. Entire communities diminished without spectacle, their absence noticed only in what failed to return. These early extinctions did not come as a final wave, but as repeated withdrawals, each one reshaping the living fabric of the ocean. Major losses occurred even as life seemed to be expanding. New forms appeared, spread, and briefly dominated local environments, only to fade as conditions shifted around them. Dominance did not create immunity. A body well suited to one configuration of temperature, chemistry, or interaction could become a liability when those elements drifted. Strength, size, or control offered no refuge when the environment itself withdrew support. Environmental instability remained constant. Circulation patterns altered nutrient delivery. Oxygen levels rose unevenly, then stalled or retreated. Chemical balances tipped with volcanic input or tectonic rearrangement. These changes were rarely abrupt, yet their cumulative effect proved decisive. Adaptation required time that was not always available. Bodies specialized for narrow success struggled to recalibrate as the ground beneath them moved. Even resilience carried limits. Traits that once allowed survival through minor fluctuation failed under sustained pressure. Reproductive timing fell out of sync with resource availability. Development faltered as internal systems encountered conditions they were not built to manage. Decline unfolded across generations, often without visible crisis, until absence replaced presence. Each extinction reset ecosystems without fully clearing them. Surviving forms expanded into newly opened spaces, altering interactions and redistributing energy. Food webs reorganized along different pathways, sometimes more simply, sometimes with new complexity. These transitions did not restore prior arrangements. They produced new ones, shaped by what remained rather than what had been lost. The ocean retained no memory of dominance. It did not preserve leaders or stabilize around successful designs. It responded only to what could persist under present conditions. Extinction served as a filter rather than an end, narrowing possibilities and redirecting evolution along paths shaped by survival rather than achievement. What vanished created opportunity for what followed, even as it erased entire lineages. Instability ensured repetition. As soon as systems found temporary balance, they faced new shifts. No extended period of calm allowed full recovery or consolidation. Life existed within cycles of emergence and disappearance, each reset carrying different consequences. Over time, these losses sculpted the pool of viable traits, favoring those that tolerated change rather than those that mastered a single state. Long before dinosaurs or familiar animals appeared, the seas had already endured multiple eras of quiet collapse. These early extinctions did not announce themselves as endings. They functioned as continual adjustments, pruning excess, removing fragility, and reshaping ecosystems again and again. Within this rhythm, life persisted not by escaping loss, but by adapting to its inevitability, carrying forward only what could endure the ocean's constant redefinition of survival. Survival gradually favored a narrower set of traits, not through triumph, but through persistence. As losses accumulated and systems reset repeatedly, certain qualities continued to reappear, carried forward by lineages that endured long enough to adapt again. These survivors were not the largest, fastest, or most elaborate forms. They were those whose designs balanced demand with reliability, functioning across a range of conditions without depending on precise alignment. Efficiency became decisive. Bodies that used energy sparingly endured fluctuations that overwhelmed heavier investments. Streamlined organization reduced internal cost, allowing more energy to be directed toward repair, reproduction, and tolerance of change. Structures that performed multiple functions replaced specialized parts that required constant maintenance. This economy of form did not limit capability, it stabilized it. Dominance proved fleeting, but efficiency lasted. A ruler could control space briefly, yet collapse when conditions shifted. A modest form could persist quietly, spreading across environments as opportunities opened and closed. These survivors did not shape ecosystems through force, but through continuity. Their presence anchored food webs, providing dependable links between energy sources and consumers. Over time, stability gathered around them. Many early ancestors of familiar animals emerged through this filtering. Soft-bodied forms with simple bilateral organization, basic sensory processing, and adaptable feeding strategies endured across changing seas. Segmentation allowed redundancy. Centralized control improved coordination without excessive complexity. Flexible movement enabled repositioning without constant exertion. These traits did not dominate immediately, but they endured. As time passed, these lineages accumulated refinement without abandoning restraint. Incremental change replaced wide experimentation. Forms grew recognizable not because evolution aimed for familiarity, but because constraint narrowed variation. What survived did so repeatedly, leaving descendants that carried forward workable frameworks. These frameworks became the foundation upon which later diversity expanded. Modern marine life traces its roots to this winnowing. Fish, mollusks, arthropods, and other enduring groups reflect solutions forged under early pressure. Their ancestors survived unstable chemistry, shifting oxygen, evolving predators, and frequent collapse by remaining adaptable rather than exceptional. Each carries echoes of a time when being adequate mattered more than being extraordinary. The foundations laid in these ancient oceans persist today in body plans that still function across vast environments. Efficient circulation, controlled movement, and balanced energy use remain central to survival. Even advanced forms retain these underlying principles, refined rather than replaced. What shaped the future was not a single victory, but accumulation. Survival selected for forms that could weather instability without exhausting themselves. Through countless generations, these survivors defined the boundaries within which life continued to evolve. Modern oceans are built upon their endurance, structured by the quiet success of traits that outlasted dominance and carried life forward through deep time. Stability did not arrive all at once. It settled gradually, spread thinly across time measured in millions of years. Tectonic motion slowed its rearrangements, circulation patterns became more repeatable, and chemistry drifted toward balances that no longer swung wildly between extremes. The ocean remained dynamic, but its rhythms grew steadier, allowing conditions to persist long enough for relationships to endure rather than reset. As this steadiness took hold, food chains began to resemble structures rather than coincidences. Producers, consumers, and predators occupied more consistent roles, linked by dependable energy flow instead of chance encounters. Feeding relationships repeated across generations, and success no longer depended solely on exploiting momentary abundance. Patterns emerged quietly, forming scaffolds upon which life could organize itself with greater reliability. These changes encouraged specialization with restraint. Organisms adapted to particular niches that remained viable long enough to reward refinement. Grazers tracked predictable resources. Predators followed recurring pathways. Detritus settled into cycles of breakdown and reuse. Waste returned to systems rather than disappearing into collapse. The ocean began to recycle itself with greater efficiency, smoothing fluctuations that once erased entire communities. Change slowed not because evolution lost momentum, but because pressure redistributed. Instead of constant environmental upheaval forcing rapid replacement, selection favored incremental improvement. Adjustments accumulated gradually, layered upon enduring frameworks. Innovations spread through populations rather than vanishing with them. Time itself became an ally rather than an obstacle. Predictability transformed behavior. Movement aligned with seasonal shifts in chemistry and temperature. Reproduction synchronized with dependable resource availability. Migration patterns, once uncertain, gained structure as environmental cues repeated. Life adapted not just to space, but to timing, responding to cycles that could be anticipated rather than merely survived. The seafloor and open water alike reflected this new order. Habitats persisted long enough for communities to stabilize around them. Boundaries between regions grew clearer as gradients held. Even disturbance, when it occurred, followed patterns that systems could recover from. Loss still happened, but it no longer rewrote everything at once. This familiarity did not imply simplicity. The ocean supported growing diversity within constrained rules. Complexity continued to build, now supported by foundations that endured. Relationships deepened, coevolution strengthened interactions, and ecosystems layered upon themselves rather than starting anew. The sea retained its capacity for change, but it changed within limits life had learned to navigate. By this stage, the oceans would begin to feel recognizable if observed from a distant future, not in the details of species or form, but in the presence of structure itself. Food webs persisted, niches repeated. Stability allowed memory to take hold in biological systems, carrying success forward rather than dissolving it. The slow arrival of familiar oceans marked a transition from experimentation to refinement. Life moved from reacting to instability toward inhabiting a world that could be learned. Within this predictability, evolution continued its work, no longer racing against constant erasure, but shaping a living system that could endure its own complexity across deep time. Ruling the early oceans did not require awareness or intent. Control emerged from placement, timing, and compatibility with surrounding flow rather than conscious choice. Bodies occupied positions where energy accumulated, where currents delivered food reliably, or where encounters favored them without effort. These organisms did not direct ecosystems, they simply aligned with them, and alignment was enough to grant temporary advantage. Dominance came from position more than strength. An organism settled at a junction of movement could intercept resources with little cost. One anchored along a productive boundary could feed continuously without travel. In open water, being present at the right depth or distance offered access to others lacked. Power did not come from overpowering rivals, but from being difficult to displace. Control existed as a byproduct of environment, rather than force exerted upon it. This form of rulership was quiet and fragile. It depended on external conditions remaining stable just long enough to matter. When circulation shifted or chemistry drifted, the same position lost value. Control dissolved without resistance, leaving the ruler exposed as simply another organism among many. Strength offered little protection once alignment failed. Rulership was temporary by design because ecosystems themselves were not built to preserve it. Energy flows adjusted continuously. Feedback loops favored redistribution over accumulation. When one form expanded too far, it altered conditions that supported its own success. Resources thinned, interactions intensified, and balance moved elsewhere. The ocean did not tolerate stagnation. It replaced rather than sustained. Leaders were not removed deliberately. They were outgrown by their surroundings. As systems reorganized, different traits aligned better with new conditions. A former ruler persisted only if it adapted quickly enough to shifting roles. Most did not. Their success locked them into positions that ceased to exist. Control became inertia. Ecosystems replaced leaders through subtle processes. Population pressure reshaped resource availability. Movement patterns redirected energy. New interactions emerged as surviving forms expanded into vacated space. No single event marked transition. Replacement occurred gradually as presence redistributed itself until dominance faded into background. This cycle repeated across early oceans. Control arose wherever conditions allowed it, then passed on as those conditions changed. The absence of memory within ecosystems ensured continual turnover. No lineage retained power through inheritance alone. Each generation faced the same requirement: alignment with the present moment. Understanding rulership in these seas requires letting go of modern assumptions. It was not command, intelligence, or aggression that defined control. It was fit between body and environment, a match that lasted only while circumstances held. When they shifted, leadership dissolved without ceremony. In this way, the early oceans taught a consistent lesson. They did not reward permanence, they rewarded compatibility. Rulers were placeholders rather than architects, occupying moments of balance that soon gave way to new configurations. Ecosystems did not build around leaders. They moved past them, reshaping themselves with quiet inevitability, leaving rulership as a temporary state within a system that favored continuous replacement over preservation. Limits entered evolution without announcement. They emerged as quiet boundaries, felt through resistance rather than failure at first. Bodies grew until materials stretched too far, coordination lagged, or energy no longer arrived where it was needed. These constraints were not imposed from outside. They arose from physics, chemistry, and biology working together, defining what could persist within water, tissue, and time. Physical laws shaped form relentlessly. Gravity, even softened by buoyancy, demanded support. Diffusion limited how quickly oxygen and nutrients could move through tissue. Surface area constrained exchange with the surrounding water, while volume increased demand. As bodies expanded or specialized, these relationships tightened. Some designs functioned beautifully at small scales but collapsed when enlarged. Others required structural support that early anatomy could not provide. The ocean allowed experimentation, but not escape from fundamental balance. Biological constraints added further narrowing. Development had to proceed reliably, not just once, but generation after generation. Complex arrangements increased the chance of error during growth. Coordination between tissues required signaling systems that consumed energy and time. When these systems became too intricate, small disruptions cascaded into systemic failure. What worked in isolated cases did not always translate into stable lineages. Because of this, many designs could never scale. They thrived briefly under specific conditions, then stalled. Growth magnified inefficiency. Strength exposed weakness. What seemed promising at one level became untenable at another. Evolution did not correct these issues, it moved past them. Designs that could not operate within constraints simply ended, leaving space for others that fit more comfortably within limits. Natural selection functioned as a filter rather than a planner. It did not guide life toward optimal outcomes or future potential. It removed what failed under present conditions. Survivors were not perfected solutions, but those that remained compatible with the environment long enough to reproduce. This process favored stability over ambition. It narrowed variation by pruning excess rather than assembling complexity. Extinction recorded these lessons repeatedly. Each disappearance marked a boundary crossed, a limit exceeded, or a mismatch sustained too long. These losses were not wasted attempts. They defined the edges of possibility. What vanished clarified what could remain. Over time, the accumulation of such boundaries shaped the course of life more strongly than any single success. As extinction removed unstable forms, evolution learned restraint. Viable designs clustered within ranges that physics and biology could support. Innovation continued, but within increasingly well-defined margins. The ocean did not reward pushing beyond constraint. It rewarded staying within it while adapting subtly to change. The legacy of these early lessons persists. Modern life carries the imprint of limits discovered long ago. Body plans, metabolic strategies, and ecological roles reflect solutions that respect constraint rather than defy it. Evolution did not achieve progress through unlimited expansion. It refined itself by learning where not to go. In this way, extinction became instruction. Each loss wrote information into the fabric of life, narrowing possibility while increasing stability. Through this quiet discipline, evolution shaped a living world built not on endless potential, but on forms that understood, without awareness, the boundaries that allowed endurance across deep time. Some bodies move through modern oceans, carrying outlines first shaped when the sea was younger and less predictable. Their forms appear settled, not because change has stopped, but because certain solutions proved durable across immense spans of time. These living echoes do not resemble relics preserved by chance. They remain because their designs still meet the ocean on terms it continues to offer. Ancient traits persist where they solve fundamental problems without excess. Simple sensory systems that detect pressure or vibration still provide early warning without demanding costly processing. Flexible bodies that bend rather than resist force still endure turbulence and contact. Repeating segments, Basic bilateral organization and centralized control remain efficient ways to coordinate movement and response. These features did not persist through stagnation, they persisted through constant testing. Many behaviors trace similar continuity. Feeding patterns repeat movements, refined long before familiar ecosystems stabilized. Slow patrols along the seafloor, opportunistic grasping, filter feeding guided by current rather than pursuit, these actions remain effective because the conditions that favor them recur. Water still moves nutrients unevenly, energy still concentrates at boundaries. Strategies that exploit these patterns do not require reinvention. What endures is not complexity, but alignment. Some strategies continue working because they remain adaptable within narrow energy budgets. They rely on timing rather than speed, positioning rather than aggression, tolerance rather than specialization. These behaviors survive because they impose minimal cost while remaining responsive to change. They do not dominate systems, they inhabit them quietly. Continuity through deep time does not imply sameness. Modern forms have refined surfaces, improved regulation, and enhanced coordination. Yet, their foundations mirror early frameworks that balanced efficiency with reliability. Evolution layered improvement onto structures that already worked, rather than replacing them outright. The result is familiarity that feels timeless, even as it carries subtle, modern variation. These echoes reveal something important about the history of life. Progress did not require abandoning the past. It required preserving what functioned under pressure. Each surviving trait represents countless moments when alternatives failed. What remains today reflects compatibility with constraint, not superiority through conquest. The ocean continues to reward these ancient strategies because its rules remain grounded in physics and chemistry that have not changed. Water still resists sudden movement. Diffusion still limits exchange. Energy still flows unevenly through space and time. Solutions that respect these limits retain relevance regardless of era. In observing living echoes, the distance between past and present narrows. Modern life carries forward decisions made without awareness, refined through endurance rather than intention. The ocean did not forget its first lessons, it integrated them. Through these enduring forms and behaviors, deep time becomes visible. The first oceans shaped ways of living that still move quietly beneath the surface today, linking vanished worlds to the present through continuity rather than nostalgia. Life remembers, not through memory, but through persistence, carrying forward what the sea allowed it to become. Far below the reach of surface rhythm, the ocean changes character. Descent strips away familiar signals, light thins, temperature steadies, and energy becomes scarce. In these depths, motion slows and variability fades, creating conditions that resemble those of Earth's earliest seas. The deep ocean does not preserve history through memory, it does so through environment. Low light defines this realm. Sunlight weakens rapidly with depth, leaving vast regions where vision offers limited advantage or none at all. Energy arrives unevenly, delivered as sinking particles, slow currents, or chemical exchange rather than constant production. These constraints mirror ancient marine conditions, where light penetration was limited and food arrived unpredictably. Life adapts by waiting, conserving, and enduring, much as it once did long before stable food webs formed. Low energy shapes behavior and form. Bodies grow slowly. Movements remain deliberate. Many organisms rely on minimal activity, punctuated by brief response rather than constant motion. Feeding strategies emphasize efficiency over pursuit, filtering what passes, exploiting contact, or using chemical cues rather than sight. These approaches echo early survival strategies, refined when chasing cost more than it returned. The deep sea favors tolerance. Pressure replaces temperature as the dominant physical constraint, yet stability prevails. Conditions change little across long spans, allowing specialization that remains viable without frequent recalibration. In this steadiness, ancient solutions persist. Soft tissues, flexible structures, and simplified organization remain effective, minimizing maintenance costs while enduring persistent stress. These designs did not survive by accident. They fit environments that demand patience. Modern echoes appear everywhere in these depths. Sensory systems emphasize touch, vibration, and chemical detection over image formation. Reproduction occurs slowly, timed to sporadic availability rather than seasonal cycles. Growth prioritizes durability over speed. These traits align closely with those that once dominated early oceans, when instability favored restraint and adaptation over expansion. The deep sea feels prehistoric because it removes later layers of ecological complexity. Without widespread photosynthesis, energy flows resemble early patterns driven by redistribution rather than production. Food webs remain short, sparse, and fragile. Dominance remains temporary. Survival depends on matching limited resources rather than controlling abundance. The resemblance lies not in the creatures alone, but in how systems function. Time behaves differently here. Change arrives gradually, filtered by distance and depth. Extinction and emergence occur without spectacle. This slow cadence preserves strategies that elsewhere were displaced by faster cycles and richer energy flow. The deep ocean acts as a refuge for forms and behaviors that surface conditions no longer favor. In these dark waters, the ocean retains a version of itself that once covered the planet more completely. Not a replica, but a reflection shaped by constraint. The deep sea carries forward lessons learned early, showing how life persists when energy is rare and conditions resist acceleration. Through this continuity, the deep ocean offers a living reference. It reveals how ancient strategies remain viable when environments reward conservation over conquest. In doing so, it connects present life to its earliest foundations, not through resemblance alone, but through shared limits that continue to define what survival looks like when the ocean sets the terms. Ancient ocean life is often described through exaggeration rather than context. Shapes without modern comparison invite dramatic language, and unfamiliar proportions are quickly framed as threatening. When fossil impressions reveal spines, elongated bodies, or unusual appendages, interpretation drifts toward spectacle. The label of monster emerges not from evidence, but from distance between expectation and reality. This misunderstanding grows from modern assumptions carried backward through time. Contemporary oceans are structured by familiar food chains and recognizable forms, so anything that falls outside those patterns feels aberrant. Early animals existed before such templates settled into place. Their bodies were shaped by environments that no longer exist, guided by constraints different from those of today. Judging them by modern standards distorts their purpose. Fear enters when function is ignored. A spike becomes a weapon rather than a stabilizer. A grasping limb suggests aggression instead of control. Size implies dominance without acknowledging energy limits or ecological role. These interpretations flatten complexity into threat. They reduce survival strategies to intention, as if these organisms chose intimidation rather than responding to pressure. In reality, early ocean animals were not designed to inspire fear. Their forms solve specific problems posed by chemistry, movement, and interaction. Spines altered contact dynamics. Plates distributed force. Unfamiliar symmetry reflected how tissues organized under early developmental constraints. Nothing about these designs implied hostility. They implied adaptation. Reframing ancient life requires setting aside modern narratives of competition and conflict. Early ecosystems operated under different priorities. Energy was scarce, stability limited, and encounters unpredictable. Features that appear excessive now often reflect efficiency then. A large body conserved energy through inertia. A rigid surface reduced damage from constant contact. An extended form increased reach without movement. Each trait carried cost and benefit balanced against environment rather than intent. Fear also arises from projection. Humans instinctively read faces, limbs, and posture as signals. Early animals did not evolve to communicate with observers. Their bodies expressed chemistry, physics, and constraint, not emotion. What appears menacing through a modern lens often lacks any equivalent meaning in its original context. These organisms did not threaten, they endured. Seeing function instead of threat restores clarity. A predator becomes a participant in energy flow. Armor becomes an accounting of survival cost. Size becomes a response to abundance rather than a declaration of power. When viewed this way, ancient oceans lose their imagined violence and reveal structure shaped by necessity. This shift in perspective changes the story we tell. Early life was not a parade of monsters, but a landscape of solutions tested under unfamiliar conditions. Each form represented alignment between body and environment for a brief span of time. Their disappearance does not reflect failure or defeat, only change. Understanding ancient ocean life requires patience and restraint. It asks for attention to context rather than spectacle, and curiosity rather than fear. By replacing assumptions with function, these early animals cease to be caricatures. They become what they always were, living responses to the first oceans, shaped quietly by survival rather than drama. Reconstructing ancient oceans begins with fragments rather than scenes. A flattened impression in stone, a pattern of mineral replacement, a repeated association of shapes within the same layer. These traces do not tell stories on their own. They offer constraints, outlining what must have existed without revealing everything that once did. From these limits, scientists begin the slow work of rebuilding environments that vanished long before memory. Fossils are read as records of interaction rather than static objects. Their position within sediment reveals energy conditions, whether waters were calm or disturbed. Grain size suggests depth, current strength, and distance from shore. Chemical signatures indicate oxygen levels, temperature ranges, and the presence of microbial activity. Each clue narrows possibilities without completing them. Reconstruction proceeds through accumulation, not revelation. Environment matters as much as anatomy. A body preserved alone offers less insight than one embedded within a broader context. Repeating patterns across regions suggest widespread conditions, while isolated forms hint at local extremes. When fossils cluster around specific layers, scientists infer moments of stability or rapid burial. Absence also carries weight, signaling environments hostile to preservation rather than lack of life. Certainty remains limited by design. Soft tissues rarely survive, behaviors leave no direct imprint, and entire ecosystems vanish without trace. Interpretations operate within confidence ranges, shaped by what can be supported rather than what feels intuitive. Models remain provisional, anchored to evidence, but open to revision as new data emerges. This restraint prevents speculation from becoming narrative. As methods improve, interpretations evolve. New imaging techniques reveal internal structures once hidden. Chemical analysis grows more precise, extracting environmental information from minerals previously overlooked. Discoveries in one region reshape understanding elsewhere, prompting reevaluation of established assumptions. What once seemed clear becomes nuanced. What once seemed unlikely gains support. This process reflects the nature of science itself. Knowledge advances through revision rather than accumulation alone. Each discovery does not simply add detail, it reshapes the framework that holds previous findings. Ancient oceans are not rediscovered as they were, but approached asymptotically, with understanding deepening without closure. Rebuilding lost worlds, therefore, requires humility. Scientists work within constraints imposed by time, decay, and chance. They compare modern analogs carefully, aware that similarity does not guarantee equivalence. They test hypotheses against new evidence, allowing conclusions to shift rather than harden. The goal is coherence, not certainty. Through this ongoing effort, ancient seas become increasingly defined without becoming fixed. Their chemistry, structure, and inhabitants gain clarity as patterns emerge across disciplines. Paleontology, geochemistry, sedimentology, and biology converge to produce shared understanding rather than definitive answers. The value of this process lies not in finality, but in continuity. Each generation refines the picture left by the last, correcting errors and filling gaps where possible. Science remains active, responsive, and incomplete, mirroring the oceans it studies. Lost worlds are rebuilt not as finished reconstructions, but as evolving interpretations shaped by evidence, revision, and time itself. Long stretches of time passed when the ocean seemed almost unchanging. Currents followed familiar paths, chemistry held within narrow bounds, and ecosystems repeated themselves with little variation. These intervals lacked drama, yet they were essential. Stability allowed life to settle into patterns that no longer required constant adjustment, turning survival into routine rather than improvisation. During these quiet spans, evolution did not stop. It slowed, pressure eased, and with it, the urgency to transform. When conditions remained consistent, drastic change offered little advantage. Bodies that already fit their environment persisted without modification, reproducing reliably across generations. Selection favored maintenance over invention, reinforcing what worked instead of experimenting with what might. Calm functioned as success. A form that endured unchanged across millions of years, demonstrated compatibility with its surroundings. Energy once spent adapting to instability could be redirected toward growth, repair, and reproduction. Systems refined themselves subtly, improving efficiency without altering structure. Change became incremental and nearly invisible, accumulating slowly beneath the surface. These periods fostered resilience. Life adapted to predictability by synchronizing internal processes with external rhythms. Feeding, movement, and reproduction aligned with dependable cycles. Communities developed depth rather than breadth, layering interactions that supported continuity. The absence of upheaval allowed ecosystems to mature, creating buffers against minor disturbance. Yet stillness did not mean stagnation. Beneath apparent calm, variation continued at small scales. Mutations arose, behaviors shifted slightly, and interactions adjusted in response to local conditions. Most of these changes remained contained, neither spreading nor vanishing completely. They formed a reservoir of possibility, held in check by stability. When environments remain constant, extreme innovation carries risk. Novel traits that disrupt balance are often filtered out quickly, not because they fail outright, but because they offer no clear benefit. In such times, restraint outperforms novelty. Evolution refines rather than reinvents, preserving a core structure while testing minor alterations. The long quiet between revolutions shaped life as much as periods of upheaval. It set baselines, defining what normal looked like for oceans that had once been unpredictable. These baselines allowed future change to register clearly, providing contrast when conditions eventually shifted. Without long, calm stretches, transformation would have lacked direction. Change waited within stillness. When chemistry drifted, currents altered, or new pressures emerged, accumulated variation suddenly mattered. Traits that had lingered quietly found opportunity. Evolution accelerated, not from nothing, but from groundwork laid during calm. The quiet held potential, storing options rather than expressing them. This rhythm repeats throughout Earth's history. Dramatic transitions draw attention, but they are brief compared to the time spent between them. The ocean evolved as much through patience as through disruption. Stability offered life a chance to consolidate, to test endurance, and to prepare silently for futures it could not anticipate. The long quiet between revolutions reveals that survival is not always about change. Often, it is about staying aligned long enough to matter. Within these extended pauses, life learned what it could keep, what it could simplify, and what it could afford to leave unchanged until the ocean asked for something different. Most evolutionary experiments ended not with violence or catastrophe, but with imbalance. New forms emerged, carrying promise, yet many demanded more energy than the ocean could reliably provide. Elaborate structures required constant input to function, and when supply fluctuated, those demands became liabilities. A design that succeeded briefly could not endure when costs exceeded return. Energy inefficiency proved unforgiving. Bodies that relied on continuous feeding struggled when resources arrived unevenly. Movement, maintenance, and internal coordination consumed reserves faster than they could be replenished. Even small inefficiencies compounded over time, narrowing margins until survival depended on uninterrupted conditions that rarely persisted. The ocean did not sustain such precision for long. Environmental sensitivity deepened this vulnerability. Many forms were tuned to specific temperatures, chemical balances, or oxygen levels that existed only within narrow ranges. Minor shifts altered internal processes enough to disrupt growth or reproduction. Because early oceans remained variable, sensitivity translated into fragility. Organisms that thrived under one set of conditions often failed quietly when those conditions drifted. Over-specialization further limited endurance. Some experiments refined a single strategy so thoroughly that alternatives disappeared. Feeding methods, body shapes, or behaviors optimized for particular niches left little flexibility. When interactions changed or competition intensified, these specialists lacked pathways to adjust. Their success depended on stability that did not last. Survival favored restraint, not because innovation stopped, but because restraint reduced exposure. Forms that did less, but did it reliably persisted longer. Simple organization tolerated variation. Flexible behavior compensated for reduced capability. These traits allowed organisms to remain functional across broader conditions, even if they never dominated any single one. Failure often unfolded gradually. Populations declined as reproduction slowed and stress accumulated. Descendants became fewer until lineage ended without trace. No sudden ending marked these losses. The ocean absorbed them as quietly as it produced them, leaving absence rather than evidence. Selection reinforced this pattern repeatedly. Experiments that pushed boundaries faded. Those that respected limits endured. Over time, the pool of viable designs contracted toward configurations that balanced energy, tolerance, and adaptability. This narrowing did not reduce diversity outright. It concentrated it within survivable ranges. The lessons of failure accumulated invisibly. Each vanished form clarified what the ocean would not sustain. Constraints became more defined as loss traced their outlines. What remained reflected compatibility rather than creativity alone. In this way, most experiments failed not because evolution erred, but because environments demanded economy. Life learned that survival was less about attempting everything and more about maintaining balance. Restraint became a quiet strength, favoring forms that endured over those that impressed. Through countless endings, the ocean shaped a living system grounded in moderation. The survivors carried forward not the boldest designs, but the most sustainable ones. Failure served as instruction, refining possibility until what remained could persist without excess. The first oceans taught through loss rather than instruction. Their lessons were written slowly, traced in vanished lineages and emptied niches rather than preserved successes. Each extinction refined the boundary of what could endure, leaving behind patterns that living systems carried forward. What disappeared mattered as much as what remained, shaping rules that no organism understood, yet all obeyed. Extinction clarified imbalance. Forms that expanded too aggressively altered conditions that supported them, thinning their own resources or destabilizing interactions around them. Dominance created pressure that returned inward, eroding advantage over time. The ocean demonstrated that control without restraint could not persist. Survival favored those that fit within systems rather than overpowering them. Balance emerged as the central lesson. Bodies that moderated growth, energy use, and interaction endured longer than those that pushed toward extremes. Balance did not imply weakness. It implied alignment with fluctuating conditions. Organisms that matched intake to demand, movement to opportunity, and reproduction to availability persisted across change. Balance allowed continuity, where excess invited collapse. Flexibility outlasted power. Strength proved situational. Speed depended on conditions that shifted. Armor carried costs that accumulated. Flexible forms adjusted behavior, position, and function without reconfiguring structure entirely. This adaptability allowed survival through transitions that erased more rigid designs. Flexibility did not dominate ecosystems. It persisted within them. The oceans taught that endurance required tolerance for variation. Chemistry drifted, currents shifted, interactions evolved. Forms that accepted these changes rather than resisting them remained viable. Life learned to distribute risk across systems rather than concentrating it in single strategies. Redundancy replaced specialization. Simplicity supported resilience. These lessons became foundational. Later ecosystems inherited frameworks shaped by early selection. Food webs favored stability over control. Communities organized around dependable energy flow rather than brief abundance. Interactions balanced pressure with recovery, allowing systems to absorb disturbance without erasure. The principles forged early continued to structure marine life long after conditions changed. Foundations laid in the first oceans persist in modern systems. Cycles of growth and loss regulate populations. Energy budgets constrain possibility. Balance shapes diversity. These patterns did not arise from foresight. They emerged from repeated adjustment under constraint. The ocean did not plan outcomes. It filtered them. Life carried these teachings forward unconsciously. Each generation inherited structures refined by countless prior losses. What survived did so not by escaping extinction, but by remaining compatible with the conditions that produced it. This compatibility formed the backbone of all future ecosystems. The first oceans did not reward ambition, they rewarded persistence. Through quiet refinement, they guided life toward forms that could endure complexity without collapsing under it. The lessons written in Extinction became guides for continuity, establishing principles that would support the expansion of life across seas yet unknown, grounded in balance, flexibility, and the enduring value of restraint. The first oceans remain relevant because the forces that shaped them never disappeared. Temperature shifts, chemical imbalance, and uneven energy flow still govern marine systems today. Modern oceans operate at a different scale, yet they respond to disturbance in familiar ways. Change does not announce itself through spectacle. It accumulates quietly, altering relationships long before collapse becomes visible. Parallels emerge most clearly in climate sensitivity. Early seas fluctuated in warmth, circulation, and oxygen availability, and life responded unevenly. Some forms adapted quickly, others lagged behind conditions that no longer favored them. Today, warming waters, shifting currents, and changing chemistry repeat this pattern. Stability favors continuity, while rapid change tests tolerance. The lesson is not historical comparison, but structural resemblance in how oceans absorb stress. Dominance remains fragile. Early rulers thrived briefly when conditions aligned, then vanished when balance shifted. Their disappearance showed that control does not equal security. Modern ecosystems reveal the same vulnerability. Species that dominate under present conditions can falter quickly when thresholds are crossed. Abundance does not guarantee endurance. Power without flexibility still erodes when environments drift. The oceans also demonstrate how systems unravel without catastrophe. Early extinctions often occurred through gradual mismatch rather than sudden destruction. Resources thinned, interactions weakened, and reproduction slowed until populations faded. This quiet failure echoes in modern declines where no single event signals collapse. Environmental change accumulates until survival no longer balances cost. These patterns offer lessons for interpreting present change. Oceans respond to sustained pressure by restructuring rather than resisting. Food webs simplify, interactions compress, and diversity narrows toward tolerance rather than dominance. Recovery, when it occurs, follows stabilization, not intervention alone. The past reveals that resilience depends on restoring conditions rather than preserving status. Relevance extends beyond marine life. The first oceans illustrate how complex systems behave under constraint. Balance supports persistence. Excess invites correction. Flexibility absorbs disturbance better than strength alone. These principles apply to any environment shaped by energy, flow, and interaction, from ecosystems to climates themselves. History becomes guidance when viewed through function instead of chronology. The early oceans do not warn through metaphor. They demonstrate outcomes that repeat when similar pressures return. Chemistry, Circulation and energy still set limits that life cannot ignore. Change still selects for compatibility rather than ambition. The enduring value of these ancient seas lies in continuity. Earth has already tested many futures. The results remain visible in what survived and what did not. Modern oceans inherit that long record, responding to stress through patterns established early in their existence. By recognizing these connections, the story of the first oceans moves beyond origin. It becomes reference. It shows how environments shape life repeatedly under constraint, and how systems endure not by avoiding change, but by remaining balanced within it. In that persistence, the earliest seas remain present, guiding understanding through time without ever speaking directly. Time in the ocean does not pass in moments or eras, but in intervals so long they lose texture. Hundreds of millions of years function not as extremes, but as background. Change unfolds slowly enough to feel continuous, yet relentlessly enough to reshape everything. What appears permanent within a human lifespan registers as brief when measured against the ocean's full history. In this scale, extinction becomes ordinary. Lineages appear, persist, and vanish as part of a steady rhythm rather than a series of crises. Loss does not require catastrophe. Gradual mismatch between form and environment proves sufficient. Conditions drift, tolerance narrows, and survival edges thin until disappearance completes itself quietly. Over deep time, extinction acts not as exception, but as structure. This frequency does not diminish its significance. Each extinction alters possibility, removing paths that will never reopen. Yet the ocean absorbs these losses without pause. New forms arise from what remains, shaped by constraints clarified through absence. Extinction clears complexity as often as it creates it, redirecting life rather than ending it. Against this backdrop, humanity occupies a moment so brief it barely registers. Our presence falls within a fraction of a single geological heartbeat. Oceans existed long before human influence and will continue long after it transforms or fades. This perspective does not reduce relevance, it refines it. Actions matter precisely because they occur within systems that persist beyond intention. Seeing through deep time alters interpretation. Stability becomes temporary. Dominance becomes fleeting. Even success reframes as conditional. The ocean reveals that endurance depends on compatibility rather than control, and that change favors what can adjust repeatedly without breaking. These patterns hold regardless of scale. Deep time also challenges perception of urgency. Rapid shifts appear dramatic, yet slow changes accumulate more thoroughly. The ocean's history shows that subtle drift often reshapes life more completely than sudden shock. Recognizing this helps align attention with process rather than event, with trajectory rather than moment. Perspective emerges from scale. When time stretches far enough, patterns replace narratives. Cycles repeat with variation. Systems reorganize under familiar pressures. What changes is not the existence of constraint, but how life meets it. The ocean remembers this through structure rather than memory. By holding deep time in view, the story of life becomes less about peaks and more about persistence. Success appears quieter, defined by longevity rather than impact. Failure becomes instructional, shaping the boundaries within which life continues. Humanity, viewed this way, joins a long sequence rather than standing apart from it. Time on this scale invites humility without dismissal. The ocean does not diminish the present by expanding the past. It situates it. Within deep time, each moment gains clarity through context. Change feels less absolute and more continuous. life appears not fragile, but conditional. Through this lens, the ocean's history becomes navigable rather than overwhelming. It shows how systems endure, how loss integrates into continuity, and how perspective emerges when time extends beyond sensation. Deep time does not obscure meaning, it refines it, revealing patterns that only appear when patience replaces immediacy. The ocean continues its work without pause. Forms shift subtly within familiar outlines, and new variations appear where conditions invite them. Evolution did not conclude with stabilization or familiarity. It persists quietly, reshaping life under pressures that differ in source but not in principle from those of the earliest seas. The same processes continue, patient and responsive. Modern oceans introduce new constraints. Temperature gradients alter circulation. Chemistry shifts with carbon exchange. Nutrient distribution changes as currents redirect energy. Life responds not with intention, but with adjustment. Some bodies grow smaller, others alter timing, behavior, or structure. These responses accumulate across generations, producing change that feels gradual until patterns emerge. New pressures give rise to new forms. Adaptation appears through altered growth rates, modified feeding strategies, and revised sensory reliance. Some organisms migrate vertically or horizontally to remain aligned with favorable conditions. Others endure in place by refining tolerance. These changes do not announce themselves. They register through persistence, revealing which designs remain compatible as environments drift. Ancient rules continue to apply. Energy efficiency still determines viability. Flexibility still outperforms rigidity. Balance still supports endurance. These constraints shaped the first oceans and remain present today. The ocean does not abandon its limits when circumstances change. It expresses them through different outcomes. The sea functions as an ongoing laboratory, testing interactions continuously. Experiments occur at every scale, from microbial chemistry to large body structure. Most changes remain incremental, refining what exists rather than inventing what does not. Occasionally, conditions favor novelty, allowing previously marginal traits to expand. Even then, success remains provisional. Modern evolution also reflects accumulation. Traits shaped under earlier conditions interact with new pressures, producing layered responses rather than clean transitions. Life adapts through modification, not replacement. The past remains embedded within present bodies, constraining and enabling change simultaneously. This continuity reinforces perspective. Evolution does not rush toward complexity or simplicity. It responds to circumstance. When environments stabilize, forms consolidate. When conditions fluctuate, variation spreads. The ocean moderates this balance through energy availability and interaction, filtering outcomes without preference. Observation reveals this process in action. Shifts in size distribution, reproductive timing, and behavior mark ongoing adaptation. No single change defines the future. Trends emerge from repetition, shaped by survival rather than aspiration. The sea continues its experiments with indifference to outcome. Understanding the ocean as an active system reframes history. The earliest experiments were not preliminary versions of modern life. They were responses to conditions that no longer dominate. Today's experiments address different constraints, yet follow the same logic. Compatibility remains the measure of success. The ocean never stopped experimenting because conditions never stopped changing. Stability slowed transformation, but did not end it. Life remains engaged in constant negotiation with its environment, refining itself within limits that persist across deep time. This ongoing process links ancient seas to present waters, showing evolution as continuity rather than sequence. Through this lens, the ocean remains what it has always been, a dynamic system shaped by constraint and possibility. Its laboratory operates without closure, guided by principles established early and applied endlessly. Evolution continues not as progress or retreat, but as adjustment, sustained by the same rules that once governed the first oceans. The ocean that built everything was never gentle. Its earliest form shifted constantly, altering chemistry, circulation, and energy without warning. Within this instability, life appeared and tested itself against limits that were still being written. Creation and loss occurred side by side, not as opposites, but as parts of the same process. The sea generated possibility, then narrowed it with equal resolve. Life ruled these waters, only briefly. Dominance emerged where conditions aligned, then faded as balance shifted. No form held control for long. Each ruler existed within boundaries it could not alter, yielding eventually to pressures that favored different designs. Power proved temporary, compatibility endured longer. The ocean accepted neither ambition nor permanence, only fit. From these early patterns, all later ecosystems descended. The rules established in the first seas persisted as foundations rather than relics. Energy flow defined structure. Chemistry set limits. Interaction shaped survival. As oceans stabilized, these principles guided expansion instead of invention. What followed did not replace the early oceans, it refined their legacy. The first oceans did not merely host life, they structured it. Body plans, behaviors, and interactions emerged in response to constraint rather than opportunity alone. Every lineage carried traces of those initial filters, encoded in efficiency, tolerance, and balance. Even when environments changed, those traits remained relevant, continuing to shape what persisted and what faded. Modern ecosystems still reflect this origin. Food webs rely on the same logic of energy and exchange. Stability favors restraint. Excess invites collapse. The ocean's early lessons remain active, expressed through continuity rather than memory. Each living system today operates within parameters set long before familiarity existed. The creativity of those early seas lay not in spectacle, but in exploration. Countless forms tested space, movement, and interaction under unfamiliar conditions. Most vanished, not because they lacked complexity, but because complexity alone could not guarantee alignment. What endured did so quietly, refining rather than redefining survival. The unforgiving nature of the first oceans was not cruel. It was consistent. Pressure applied without preference. Outcomes followed compatibility, not intention. Through this consistency, life learned how to persist without control. The ocean shaped life by restricting it, narrowing possibility until what remained could endure. This closing does not mark an ending, but a settling. The long story of the ocean resolves not into triumph, but into continuity. The waters that once shifted unpredictably became stable enough to support familiar forms, yet they never abandoned the principles forged early. Change slowed, but it did not stop. Constraint softened, but it did not vanish. The ocean that built everything remains present. Its influence carries forward through structure, balance, and persistence. Life continues to respond to the same forces that once governed the first seas, shaped quietly by an environment that never promised permanence, only the chance to fit, for a time, within its limits.